Well, thank you so much, Rachel, for inviting me, and Robert. I'm really excited to be here and to chat with you guys about some of the work I do. I'm a professor at UC Davis, and I work on conservation and agricultural landscapes, mostly of birds. Before I kind of launch into the specific study systems that I'm working in, I want to take kind of a global view on conservation. So right now, about 15% of our Earth's surface, that's the terrestrial sort of land surface, is covered in protected areas. And that's a pretty good number. It's been increasing over the last few decades, although that rate of increase has slowed. And it reflects our knowledge that one of the best ways to prevent biodiversity loss is to create these protected areas where you can sort of mitigate habitat loss and hunting and other sorts of pressures. But that number pales in comparison to the amount of Earth's surface that's covered in agriculture, both cropland and rangeland, which sits somewhere around 40% of Earth's surface. And for a really long time, biologists, conservation practitioners, they sort of ignored the agricultural systems. They viewed it a lot like this picture. This is one of the places I work in Costa Rica. It's a sugarcane plantation, sort of stretching as far as the eye can see. This kind of agricultural landscape is probably something that's pretty familiar to you guys in the Central Valley, where you'll drive for miles and miles and see sort of one or two crops. And you wouldn't see there'd be too much kind of scope for conserving birds or other wildlife in a landscape that looks like this. But not all agriculture looks like this. Here's another picture. This is also from where I work in Costa Rica. This is a coffee growing system. And in this place, there's only one protected area. It's a glorified forest fragment. It's only about 200 hectares in size. And yet, when viewed from above, there's actually a lot of forest here. So let's take you through into this picture and kind of point out a few reasons why we might think that there would be a lot more diversity in a landscape like this. So first, as I noted, you actually see that there's a lot of forest left in this landscape. You can see sort of I'm highlighting this little patch of forest in the foreground and then larger areas in the back. Even though there's only that small protected area, about 35% of the area exists as tropical forest. It's just existing on private land in these smaller patches. You'll also note that there are these lines sort of demarcating the plot boundaries. These are hedgerows or live fences. And just like they would up here in California, we know that these hedgerows are really important for conserving pollinators as well as birds around these farms. And then we also notice it's not just one crop here. We've got some banana in the foreground, a little patch of it in the back. It's intercropped with coffee plants here in the foreground and then a large patch of that in the background. Got a little pasture over on the left. And so together, this is what I would call a much more diversified farming system. And it's in these sorts of landscapes that we would expect to see a lot more biodiversity. And so when I was first getting started as a scientist, back when I was doing my graduate work, we were comparing bird communities between those diversified agricultural systems like this picture and those sort of what I would call intensive monocultures, those vast crops of one variety, and then forest reserves. And we did this using a really remarkable data set of bird surveys all across Costa Rica, 48 different locations surveyed for well over a decade. And you can see here that if you just look on the y-axis, this is the number of species you see at every given transect where we're counting up birds. You can see that the numbers are pretty stable over time. And in the forest reserves and the diversified agriculture, you see about as many species. But when you move into those intensive monocultures, you actually see a lot fewer species. And it's not just in Costa Rica that you see these kinds of trends. Another example that I really love is from the Midwestern United States, where they're studying what they call prairie strips. There's these kind of small areas, less than 10% of a crop field, that would be seeded in sort of native prairie plants. And they've shown that by doing this, you can bolster plant diversity fourfold, you can increase bee abundance and diversity, abundance ninefold, diversity threefold, and birds abundance fourfold, diversity twofold. And you also see a lot of other benefits. You see benefits in terms of preventing erosion and sedimentation and minimal cost to yield. So this kind of small intervention that can have a really big impact. And in fact, you can begin to see that in these diversified agricultural systems, the farmers might actually benefit from having some of that diversity around. Pollination is a classic example. The pollination biologists have shown for a really long time that by having those patches of habitat around farm fields, that you can have bees coming onto your fields and pollinating your crops and actually increasing your yields a lot and providing an economic benefit to you. I work on pests and their sort of natural predators. And there's a practice sort of tracing back into ancient times in China where farmers would cultivate ant nests and place them throughout their orchards to control fruit fly infestations. It's a practice that continues on to today. And there's decent evidence to suggest that at least in some systems, by having more habitat around your fields, you might be able to enhance the predators of crop pests and therefore get better control and sort of incentivize the farmer to engage in conservation practices. So in this sort of introduction, I'm painting this really rosy picture, right, of how we could basically have our crops or our cake and eat it too, right? We could have all of these benefits of having biodiversity in these agricultural systems. But what I want to do today is interrogate that idea a little bit and ask whether that's a little bit too rosy of a picture, or maybe it's not. The first part of the talk today will focus on our work in Costa Rica and ask about these diversified agricultural systems and what kinds of species in particular are able to persist in that farmland. I said there's a lot of species locally, but are they the species we really care about? And then second, we'll refocus back to California agricultural systems that we all know a lot better. And we're going to ask, are there any trade-offs with conserving biodiversity, with conserving birds in these systems? Can we still produce a lot of food? And are there any consequences for food safety? We're going to be thinking about foodborne disease outbreaks like E. coli and salmonella that you often see in the news, and ask whether having more wildlife around could be problematic from that perspective. So let's start off with Costa Rica, thinking about what kinds of species are persisting in agricultural systems. And for this part of the talk, we're going to think of a particular study system where I've worked a lot. It's in Northwest Costa Rica in the Guanacaste area. And we've set up this system where we've got these 25 different locations, 20 farms and 5 protected areas that exist along this precipitation gradient. So near the coast, it's a lot wetter, tropical rainforest. And then as you go in more inland, it becomes a lot drier. So here you could imagine like Palo Verde National Park, if any of you guys have been to Costa Rica, is right around here in this dry area. And so we've got these 25 different locations. Each one of those, we have 6 different specific sites where we're counting birds. We did that for 4 years, identifying all the birds that we could see or hear within 50 meters for 20 minutes. These are called point counts. And we would have locations both in sort of privately owned forests, both in the interior of them and in the small fragments, and then also in the agricultural systems themselves. And so using this kind of system, we can start to ask questions. First of all, how does agriculture affect bird diversity? Just the number of species, kind of like that graph I showed before. Here on the x-axis, we have the amount of local forest cover, okay? So over here on the right, we can think of this as like, you know, a protected area, 100% forest. And on the left, 0%, this is like an intensive agricultural field, no trees left. And what you see here is that you increase the forest cover, you do get more and more bird species, but not that many more. And you're sort of peaking around 75, 80% forest cover. So we do see here that agriculture is more or less maintaining the number of species, at least at this local sort of farm scale. But what's really critical here, and as I was alluding to, we might want to know not only how many species are present, but what types of species are present. And for all the birders in the room, you would sort of automatically expect that the kinds of species that you would expect to see if you went into a tropical rainforest and out in an agricultural field might be different. And indeed, we see that. The species that live in forests and on farms are very distinct. And we can use our sort of statistical models and characterize each species and find that about 30% of the 150 that we work with are really kind of forest species that only stay in the forest, species like this long-tailed manakin here. Others are primarily found in the agricultural areas, about 26% of them, species like this caracara. And then still others we have, like this gray-tailed grackle, which also exists up here in California. About 44% of them can live in both forest and agricultural systems. And what's really key is that the species associated with drier locations, remember we said that we were working both in the drier areas and the wetter areas. We see that the species that had historically sort of evolved and thrived in these dry climates are really thriving on farms, whereas the species that are more restricted to wet regions end up only being able to be in forests. And that's really key because this area of Costa Rica is expected to dry considerably with climate change looking forward. And so if we do some climate change projections into the future, we find that climate change is really going to favor those agricultural birds, those birds that are already doing okay alongside people, whereas the species that might be suffering with habitat loss are going to be not so much favored by climate change looking forward. Moreover, if we look to see, like, what are the kinds of species that survive in these agriculture systems? Are they more threatened or are they of less conservation concern? One way that we can measure that is by the range size of the species. Species that are really broadly distributed would be of less conservation concern. So what I could do, for example, would be just calculate the average range size of the birds that we see in this forest agricultural system in Costa Rica and then plot that. Here again on the x-axis, we've got the amount of forest cover. On the y-axis, we've got the average of all the birds we're seeing, their average range size. And what you see is in these agricultural sites, you see a lot of these wide-ranging birds, birds like that gray-tailed grackle here that ranges all the way from, Colombia up into the United States. Whereas in the forested areas, we see birds like that long-tailed manakin that you can see right here have that much more restricted range. So those narrow-ranged endemic birds of higher conservation concern, they're going to be more forest restricted. Another interesting analysis that we did was look at how these birds are sort of valued by people, okay? And to look at that, we considered cultural ecosystem services, or these different benefits, these kind of psychological or intangible benefits people derive from birds, the kind of benefits that we get by being birders. And I worked with this amazing graduate student who's now a postdoc at Stanford University, Alejandra Echeverri, who conducted more than 400 in-person surveys of bird watchers and urbanites and local farmers. And she was trying to assess the value of each bird that we saw, all 150 of them. So she'd show people pictures of these birds, she'd play their songs, and people would either recognize them or not, and she would ask them to score them in a variety of different sort of dimensions. The first one, how beautiful are they? How important are they sort of to be seen? How much would you want to see them from a sort of a bird watching perspective? And then they'd listen to their calls and ask how aesthetically pleasing they found their calls. And then they would ask other questions like, is this bird sort of important and emblematic from your perspective as sort of your local identity? Does it give you this sense of place, of being here? Is the species important from an educational perspective? Do you think we should research it more? Are you interested in learning more about this bird? Would you like to preserve this bird for future generations? This is called bequest value. How important is it that that bird stick around for the future? And of course, we were also interested in seeing whether there would be any species that people didn't like as much. Maybe they find it harmful, like it's damaging their crops, or annoying, or it's defecating on all of their on their houses or something like that. So we'd ask about that as well. And the key result was that in every single one of these dimensions, we found that the forest-associated birds, the birds that really only thrived in these forest areas, were scoring higher in every one of these categories except these disservices. So the forest birds were the ones that people wanted to see and hear, were more important for their local identities of the people. People wanted to research them more. They wanted them around for future generations more. And the agricultural ones were the ones that they were more concerned about. So, okay, this tells us that, well, maybe there are a lot of species in agricultural systems, but maybe they aren't the ones that we care about as much, or the ones that we really want to conserve looking forward. So another question we could ask ourselves is whether we would be able to conserve birds not within the agriculture themselves, but in those little patches of forest that are privately owned, not the protected areas, in these agricultural landscapes. Now, these areas are different than a protected area, right? If you look at a picture like this, you see it's heavily fragmented, so interspersed between the agriculture and the forest. We also see there's a lot of logging going on in these areas and a fair amount of illegal hunting as well. So here's a picture that we took of someone walking into one of these forest patches to go hunt. So we might expect that we could see very different kinds of species in these privately owned forests than in the protected areas. And yet we didn't see that. Actually, we found that as you increase forest cover on the private lands, you create a more and more what we would call reserve-like bird community, to the point where when you have a patch of forest that's sufficiently large and privately owned, so within 50 meters, if you just have forest, even if it's privately owned, even if there's lots of fragmentation in the surrounding landscape, you still have a bird community there that's pretty much indistinguishable from those that are found in the forest reserves. And what's even cooler is that using all of this information, then we can build some statistical models to help guide local conservation efforts, right? So we've partnered with local NGOs that are engaged in reforestation within these biological corridors, and they're interested in trying to figure out where they should focus their efforts. And using this information, how can we create the most reserve-like bird community? We can show that, especially in areas that are sort of wetter and closer to the coast and that are surrounded by more forest, you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck. If you were to kind of change one of those little areas from agriculture into forest, you're going to create a bird community that's much more similar to that reserve. And so this is information that we were able to both publish in scientific journals, but then also give back to a lot of the sort of local conservation efforts through reports and talks and things in Costa Rica. So targeting reforestation to these wetter, more forested sites can really benefit these reserve-affiliated birds. All right, so far we've learned that the species that exist in farmland might be different from the ones that live in forest preserves, but that maintaining those patches of forest in the agricultural landscape can be really good for bird communities, at least in Costa Rica. So now what I want to do is let's kind of shift our frame of reference entirely and move from the tropics to our backyards in California and ask, are there any trade-offs with having those patches of habitat around farm fields for farmers? And to ask this question, I want to start off with a little bit of a story. So some of you guys might remember way back in 2006, there was this E. coli outbreak associated with bagged spinach. It was traced back to the central coast of California, where most of the leafy greens for the nation are grown. More than 200 people got sick, several people died, hundreds of millions of dollars of lost sales occurred as, all of these bagged products were taken off the shelves. And on this farm, the originating strain was found in the soil and in the water, but also in the feces of cattle and wild pigs. And the wild pigs were the kicker, because it led industry to believe that wildlife were bringing these pathogens onto farm fields. And ever since that outbreak in 2006, there's been incredible pressure on growers to do everything they can to keep wildlife away from their farms. So we see practices like, you see these PVC pipes, these are rodent traps. Inside there might be snap traps or anticoagulant rodenticides that are lining the farm field edges. We also see lots of fencing. Most of the Salinas River corridor is now fenced. And then most critical, what I'm going to be talking about today, is there was a ton of vegetation removal. About 13% of the remaining riparian habitat, and there wasn't that much remaining, along the Salinas River was cleared before the outbreak to immediately following it within 3 years, and entirely due to that outbreak. We've done surveys subsequent to that. We did a survey in 2015 of hundreds of California produce growers and found that about 40% of them were still clearing vegetation years later. It's a practice that continues up until today. So why are farmers doing this? Why are they removing habitat? One of the major reasons is pressure from their buyers. So the buyers, the Walmarts and Costco's and other kind of big corporations of the world will send out these auditors to their farm fields and say, you need to do all of these different kinds of practices that will ensure we get a safe product, or we won't buy for you. So we do interviews with farmers, and they have quotes like this one, where this is a grower saying, if I want to play ball with the buyers, I need to do certain things that I'm not particularly happy about, but I do it anyway. So these growers might not want to clear habitat, but they're sort of pressured to. Other growers might really strongly believe that that habitat is actually a problem, and that introducing wildlife into the growing environment is a hazard from a food safety perspective, and they'll express sentiments like this. I think that side of food safety has been really good because we've done a lot of work to keep the place clean and minimize habitats for things like rats and squirrels. This idea that we need to create sort of a sterile hospital-like condition in agricultural systems. So this led me to ask this question, all right, is this habitat removal effective? Is it making our food safer? And I first started working on this question years ago as a postdoc. And to get at this question, I partnered with a large leafy greens corporation, and they gave me access to this remarkable data set, hundreds of thousands of pathogen tests of their leafy green products across 74 farms from the years 2007 to 2013. They were testing for enterohemorrhagic E. coli, EHEC, that's the kind that gets you sick, and then also salmonella. They also had tests of indicator E. coli in water. This is generic E. coli. It might be associated with the kind that gets you sick, but it might not. So kind of view that as a caveat there, about 7,000 tests across 480 farms. And then we also had a smaller test, sort of an academic style analysis from a graduate student of 800 tests of rodents on 9 farms. And so the most simple thing that we can do is go to those sites where these data were collected, where these tests were taken, and quantify the landscape around them. So here I have a radius of around 1.5 kilometers, and we've characterized the landscape. All right, how much of it is cropland? How much of it is natural habitat? How much of it is riparian vegetation? How much of it is what we would call grazed or grazable land? Grazed land is really critical here because we know that a lot of these diseases like E. coli came out of confined animal feedlots and are heavily associated with cattle. So what kind of associations do we see? Well, here you can see the effect of 4 different surrounding land use types on enterohemorrhagic E. coli and leafy greens. And you can see that all of these lines here for these 3 are sort of crossing zero, no significant effects of cropland, riparian vegetation, or other natural habitat. There was a significant effect of grazed lands. If you had more grazed areas around farm fields, there was a higher likelihood of testing positive for pathogenic E. coli, and that's not super surprising. We know that this is associated with cattle, but we did not see any of those effects of riparian habitat or other type of natural habitat. And if you look at the other data sets, if you look at E. coli in water or salmonella in leafy greens or rodents, you also don't see that. And in fact, you actually, when you dig a little bit deeper, you even see a really surprising result. And that's because these data sets are temporal, we can look at the change in E. coli over time on the farms that did or did not remove habitat. So here on the x-axis, we have more negative numbers indicating a greater removal of habitat, so greater decline in natural habitat here on the left. And what you can see is those farms actually saw a greater increase in pathogenic E. coli over time. You might look at this little dot up here and say, is that driving everything? If you remove it, this is still a significant trend. There's still a lot of scatter here. So the way that I like to explain this when I talk to industry is that, you know, it's kind of unclear still a little bit whether removing habitat made things a lot worse, but it certainly didn't make things better. There's no stretch of the imagination where this is a positive relationship. So if anything, habitat removal would increase these food safety risks. And it's not just our work. There's been studies in other regions. For example, some work on salmonella in New York produce fields found that having these kind of vegetated buffers around farm fields reduced the likelihood of detecting salmonella. There was some work in North Carolina produce fields next to animal operations showing that tree lines reduce the transmission of salmonella and E. coli from those animal operations to the farms. And then even in our backyard in the Central Valley, there was some work on hedgerows showing that having hedgerows around didn't increase the likelihood that rodents would go into farm fields or that those rodents would bring pathogens into walnut orchards or tomato fields in the Central Valley. Okay, so I've been talking a lot about this food safety stuff, and you guys are probably scratching your heads at this point saying, wait, this is the Audubon Society. Why aren't you talking about birds? So let's get back to the birds here. And there is a reason I've been talking about all of this food safety issue, and that's because growers are very concerned about birds. Here's a quote from one farmer that says, the thing that worries me more actually are birds, because you can't control birds. They're constantly flying over your farm fields. They come in and sit in your field and they carry salmonella. And so because of that, there's lots of concern and efforts now to try to keep birds away from farm fields. So if we need to kind of understand how birds are affecting foodborne pathogens and how that habitat removal affects the birds, and then what that means for foodborne sort of pathogens and food safety risks, we need to think about multiple things. The first thing we need to know is whether the species carries the pathogen in question, and different species might or they might not. If they don't, then we don't need to worry about it. If they do, then we need to know whether that species is actually coming in contact with the crop. Is it a species that is staying in the adjacent natural habitat and never coming onto the farm field? If so, we don't need to worry about it. If it is coming into the field and pooping on the product, then we need to know, is the bacteria actually surviving for a long time up until harvest? Or is it just dying off really quickly? If it dies off really quickly, we don't need to worry about it. But if it does, then we have this risk of spillover, right, from the bird to people and this potential of causing this foodborne disease outbreak. So to get at these questions, we compiled a couple different data sets. We went into the literature, used some of our own studies, and then worked with some other scientists across the Western US and gathered 11,000 tests of pathogenic E. coli, salmonella, and another disease, Campylobacter, in wild birds caught on 90 different produce farms, 95 different bird species. We also used some bird surveys, about 1,500 of these point counts across 300 sites, 350 sites in the Western US. And then we had this kind of fun data set of bird poops that were collected across 35 farms, and then people would go in and they would use the DNA of the poop to figure out who that originating species was, who was the culprit that pooped that poop on that farm field. And so we had about 500 bird feces to look at there. Okay, so the first thing that we want to know is how often are birds testing positive for these pathogens? For pathogenic E. coli, it was extremely rare. 0.2% of birds tested positive. For salmonella, 0.5%. Again, very, very rare. For Campylobacter, it was more common. About 8% of the birds were testing positive. But there's a big caveat here in that there's some recent work to suggest that the strains of this pathogen, Campylobacter, that birds carry might actually be different than the ones that affect people. And so that's a big, big thing to keep in mind. Nonetheless, because we have about 8% of the birds testing positive, we can do some statistics on this and try to figure out which species are more or less likely to carry this disease. And we find that the species that associate with livestock that you would occasionally find in rangeland or in confined animal feedlots, species like blackbirds and starlings are more likely to carry Campylobacter. They're also more likely to come in contact with produce, and they're more likely to be those ones that are defecating on the crops, though those species would be relatively higher risk. On the other hand, insect-eating species were less likely to carry pathogens. And this is really key because it means that farmers might be able to recruit species like bluebirds and swallows onto their farm fields by putting up nest boxes without suffering higher food safety risks. All right, so we know something about which species are carrying pathogens and which ones are coming onto farm fields. What about this question about how long pathogens survive in bird poop? To do this, we need to do an experiment. So this is really recent work. It's not published yet. It's stuff we're working on right now. What we do is we grow a non-pathogenic strain of E. coli in the lab, a strain that we would collect from a field in the Salinas Valley, so it's natural, but it wouldn't harm people. We then grow it up in the lab, we collect bird poop, and we inoculate it with this E. coli. For this part of the story, we're going to be focusing on wild turkey poop and bluebird poop. And then we put it back into the farm field and then collect it after known times and quantify the amount of it that's remaining. So our really, really early results here suggest that it is the size of the bird poop that really matters. It actually doesn't matter if it's from a turkey or from a bluebird, but it's the size that matters. So bluebirds and turkeys, they poop very different sizes. The turkeys are going to poop these really big, like 5-gram poops, and the bluebirds are more like 0.06 grams. But if you kind of standardize those and subset down and take only a small size of the turkey, the same size as the bluebird, then there's no difference between them. So if you look at these different sizes, you see that within a day, if you have a typical songbird size, sorry, that says songbird turkey size, it's actually just songbird, should be written there, songbird size, you see that within a day, it's a really, really low likelihood that that E. coli is still going to be around or detected at all. For the juvenile turkey size of 2 grams, it's about 50% chance by the next day, but it declines quite rapidly. And for the turkey, the adult turkey, you can see it persists for a while. And these results are really, really important. It allows us to kind of ask some interesting questions like, can farmers ignore small songbird feces? And so maybe ignore the songbirds from a food safety perspective and key in on the larger species? Also, could you judge the food safety risks by species according to their fecal size and sort of like look in the field and see if you see a small poop, then maybe you don't need to be as worried about it as a large one? Okay, so now we're beginning to get a sense of which species are more risky than other species. Now what I want to do is think about how that habitat around farm fields affects the birds and how that then affects agricultural production. And for that, we're going to focus on strawberries and on lettuce, okay? When we think about agricultural production, we think that birds can affect it in multiple ways. So this is some really cool work that I did both through kind of the USDA and the National Science Foundation. It was really led a lot by an amazing postdoc, Alyssa Olympi. And so we've seen so far that birds could affect our crops by contaminating it, right? They could come on to the farm field and poop and bring these foodborne pathogens. That's one way. But they could also eat our food, right? Lots of birds might like to eat strawberries as much as we do, and so they might act as pests. But birds could also benefit us. They could eat the pests of our crops. For example, barn swallow might eat this lygus bug that is the primary pest of strawberries and provide us with a benefit. But it could actually even get more complicated than that, right? We could have these birds eating the beneficial bugs like this big-eyed bug that then eats the pest bug that then eats the crop. And so it could disrupt pest control. So there's any number of things that could happen. So what we did was we set up a lot of kind of different farms that we were going to be working on, 20 organic strawberry farms and 20 lettuce farms, surveyed per year from 2018 to 2020. And we were explicitly choosing these farms so that they would vary in key ways. They would sort of independently vary in their local diversity. So are they growing multiple crops? Do they have hedgerows and other types of non-crop vegetation within them or not? And then what kind of landscape are they in? Are they in a landscape that has a lot of ungrazed semi-natural or natural habitat nearby? Do they have a lot of grazed natural habitat nearby? We know that grazing is really important from that food safety perspective, or not. And for the strawberry study, we were collecting birds. We were capturing them with mist nets and collecting their poop to look at things like what they were eating and whether they were carrying pathogens. And for the lettuce study, we weren't capturing birds, we were doing bird counts on the farms, and then just looking at the ground and quantifying how many feces we see and collecting them. All right, so starting with the strawberry study, we saw actually only 2 strawberries of more than 10,000 that we looked at were actually touching bird poop. But we also know that irrigation can sort of spread the bird poop around. So, you could still have food safety risks even if you're not directly touching those strawberries. Still, out of the nearly 1,000 birds that we captured and collected poop from, only 0.1% of them tested positive for pathogenic E. coli, 0 tested positive for Salmonella, and only 3.6% tested positive for Campylobacter. And for Campylobacter, it was really interesting. We found that the birds that were caught on farms that had more habitat around them, so that's moving across this x-axis, were less likely to test positive for Campylobacter. So species or individuals that are of lower food safety risk are found on these farms that have more habitat around them. What about the lettuce study? For the lettuce study, we found that out of 600 species that we collected directly from the ground, none of them tested positive for pathogenic E. coli or Salmonella, and about 5.7% tested positive for Campylobacter. We then decided that we would define a bird poop as, we call it potentially pathogenic, as if it tested positive for Campylobacter, that might or might not be the strain that affects people, or if it tested positive for any form of E. coli that has any of these genes that are associated with pathogenicity. For E. coli to be pathogenic to people, it needs to not only carry the gene that produces the toxin, but also adhere to your cells. And there were some birds that had the gene to adhere to your cells, they just didn't produce the toxin. So we call those potentially pathogenic. And we find that there was no effect of that local diversity around the farm on potentially pathogenic species. There was no effect of that surrounding ungrazed habitat, but there was an effect of that grazed habitat again, just like before, more grazed habitat around the farm field, higher density of these pathogenic feces, greater food safety risks here. All right, what's going on here? Why is that? What could be driving these trends? One of the things that we could try to understand or kind of look at with these food safety risks is try to understand what are the species that are existing on these different farms, how are these communities changing? And we find that the ungrazed habitat around farms, just the riparian areas and oak woodlands, that's really key for what birds you're going to see on the farm. If you have more ungrazed habitat around the farm, you see more species, and the species that you see are of higher conservation value. So here what we've done is we sort of, for every bird in the kind of data set that we observed, there is a conservation score that has been given to it based on whether it's sort of declining or not, and how many, the total population size, all of that. So think of species like oak titmouse that is relatively restricted and declining, high conservation value, and invasive species like starling, low conservation value. We could average that for every place that we surveyed, and we see that as you increase the amount of ungrazed habitat, you are shifting towards a community that is less dominated by these low conservation value birds and more dominated by these high conservation value birds. And another key thing is these low conservation value birds tend to form these big flocks. So species like starlings and blackbirds, they form these big flocks. And so we actually saw fewer instances of bird flocks occurring on these farms that had more habitats around them. Instead, you're sort of replaced by this diverse community of, kinglets and flycatchers and wren tits and warblers and oak titmice. And that's really key because we know that these big flocks that are coming onto the farm field might poop a lot and contribute food safety risks. So the ungrazed habitats are promoting birds of higher conservation concern and fewer flocking species. Those flocking birds might also pose problems for the farmers because they might be eating the product. So how did we figure out what birds are eating? Well, we would put up these nets, as I said, around the strawberry fields. We would take the birds out of these nets. We would put them in these cloth bags, these sterile cloth bags. And when they were in the bag, they would freak out, they would get really nervous, and they would poop. And that was great. That was the data we really cared about. So we would take them out of the bag, we would, process them, give them a band, send them on their way, and we would collect that poop, and then we could sequence it and figure out exactly what insects and plants they were eating. We had about 1,000 fecal samples from 50 species. And doing this sort of thing, we find that all of these species pictured here, many of which you guys probably recognize, are eating the primary pest of strawberries, that Lycospisparis pest, which is great. But in all of these species, we also see strawberry DNA. And in many of them, we also see the DNA of beneficial bugs like the big-eyed bug. So we need to ask ourselves now, all right, how is that feeding activity then changing as you switch from a farm that has more or less habitat around it? And what we find here is that when you have less habitat around it, you see that birds are more likely to be eating the strawberries, the beneficial bugs, and the pest insects. Whereas if you have more habitat around them, they're doing less of all of that. They're feeding on a lot of stuff that occurs in the habitats around them. And we can actually corroborate this sort of DNA-based approach by looking at the berries themselves. We characterize what we call flick damage. This is the birds, when they're eating strawberries, they kind of grab it and then flick pieces all over this plastic mulch here. And we see that as you increase the amount of habitat around a farm field, the likelihood of observing that flick damage tends to decline. So surrounding non-crop vegetation is kind of reducing that overall feeding activity of the pests, of the beneficial insects, and of the strawberries themselves. But that doesn't tell us what that net outcome is for the farmer. What does that mean in terms of their yields? And to get at that, we need to do an experiment. We need to do an experiment where we prevent the birds from accessing the strawberries by building cages around them, and then compare what happens to the strawberries inside the cage to areas that are uncaged. So we had 14 farms we were doing this. We were monitoring them weekly for berry damage and insects, harvesting these berries every week or so from these plots. This was a great project. We got tons and tons of strawberries that we could eat, these fresh organic strawberries. They were delicious. It was one of my favorite projects we did for that reason. So what did we find? Well, we found that insects damaged far more berries than birds did. So insects were a much bigger problem than birds. Nonetheless, the net effect of birds was slightly negative. Birds were causing a little bit more harm than they were helping. It was about 3.5% loss in yield. And this was likely due to both birds eating the strawberries and consuming beneficial insects. But again, what matters here is the farm management. What happens on a farm where you have habitat around it versus what happens when you don't? What's really cool is we can use our models to try and answer that question and actually project what the economics would be for the farmer. So imagine a farm like this one that has some habitat around it. Well, here we predict that there's a slight sort of negative effect of birds everywhere on the farm, versus a farm like this that has basically no habitat in the surrounding landscape. We see that along the edges of the farm, we see a lot of feeding activity from species like house finches, really substantially reducing yields. And in the center of the farm, you see birds like swallows flying over them and eating pest insects, actually contributing a net benefit to the farmer. So what would happen if we took this farm and added a lot of habitat back? So it changed from one that had no habitat in the surrounding landscape to about 50%. Well, we would actually see a 25% decline in the costs associated with birds. On the other hand, if we had this farm right here, which had a lot of habitat surrounding it, and we got rid of all of it, we would see a 75% increase in costs. So this tells us that the surrounding habitat can actually mitigate the costs associated with wild birds. All right, so we've covered a lot of stuff today. To kind of wrap up and kind of remember some of the key takeaways, the first thing that we talked about was this conservation of birds in tropical working landscapes in Costa Rica. We learned that these diverse bird communities can thrive on farms, almost as diverse as in the tropical forests that exist nearby, but the species on farms and forests are different. With those more vulnerable species and the species that provide benefits to people, those cultural services, those birds really preferring the forests. However, conserving privately owned forests within these agricultural landscapes can actually benefit a lot of these species that people value. In California, there was all of this concern about food safety and all of this habitat removal that's ongoing. How can we co-manage these farms for food production, food safety, and conservation? We find that at least in this area, in this region, habitat removal does not improve food safety, but it does compromise crop yields. And we find that on-farm bird diversity provides benefits to farmers, but it also imposes costs. However, maintaining that habitat nearby can really improve some of those net outcomes. So with that, I would like to acknowledge all of our amazing co-authors, the many farmers, growers, and landowners we've worked with, our funders, the National Science Foundation and the USDA, all of you guys for listening, and I'll take any questions you guys might have. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Daniel. That was a wonderful presentation. So now, to all of you here in the audience, if you have any questions, please feel free to go ahead and drop them into the chat box right now. And I'll check back here momentarily to see whether or not anyone has put anything in there. Yeah, sometimes it takes a few moments. So
yeah, totally. No, I've done a COVID times, lots of teaching on Zooms, and like there's always a delay.
Yeah. Oh, here we go. So we got a question here from Fresno Audubon, and it says, are hedgerows catching in California?
Are hedgerows catching in California?
Yes, or is that
like taking off? Like people are doing them? Is that the question? Okay. Yeah.
Catching, yeah.
Yeah, so there was a lot of movement towards hedgerows in a lot of contexts, in a lot of different contexts in the early 2000s. This food safety stuff was a gigantic impediment to hedgerows, to the point where lots and lots of farmers growing fresh produce of any kind are pulling them out, or did pull them out, or continuing to not plant them because of that. So there's lots of efforts to increase hedgerows around farms, and people are beginning to adopt it, sharing, I hope, this kind of work that shows that those food safety risks don't really exist with hedgerows could be a step in the right direction to making them a little bit more popular.
Okay, thank you, Daniel, sorry. Looks like we don't have any other questions at the moment, so we'll just give it a few more moments here to see if anyone has anything else they want to drop there into the chat box. Okay, we got another one here. Oh, here we go. This one is from Maria. She says, I work at a wastewater treatment plant where the vegetation is removed entirely over hundreds of acres. Do you know if this is a requirement for maintaining wastewater treatment plants? I'm guessing that's what that's
Yeah. No, I mean, I've never worked explicitly in wastewater treatment plants. I will say that there is lots of evidence that, vegetation is really good at helping treat water, preventing, runoff, sedimentation, and then also like a lot of nutrient issues as well as foodborne pathogens. And so people will use bioremediation a lot to deal with issues in water treatment, especially around farm fields, but I don't know whether in wastewater treatment plant facilities, whether it's required to remove vegetation or not, and what the rationale would be.
Thank you, Daniel. We do have a question here that I missed. It says, how are growers responding to your work?
Yeah, so it's an interesting thing. The growers often really buy into it, right? They are often a lot more experienced than I am. They're out there every day and they see all of these things happening, and they don't really believe in some of these food safety sort of hypes that are happening around the non-crop vegetation and wildlife and things like that. And yet, lots of the growers are sort of powerless. And so it's really important not to think of growers as bad guys in this situation, right? They have a livelihood they've got to maintain. And if their buyers come to them and say, you have to do this, or we will not buy from you and you will lose all of your product, there's nothing they can do, right? So the leverage point is not the buyers, it's actually the industry sort of it's not the growers, it's the industry buyers and sort of the auditors that go out to the farm fields that need to be convinced. And we've done lots of sort of workshops and trainings and things trying to spread the word about where the science is on this, but getting those folks in the room is really, really hard. And all of the standards that they use, all of those audits that I talked about, they're all proprietary. They all compete with each other over their food safety standards. So it ends up being a lot more complicated than you might expect.
Okay. Well, thank you. Looks like we don't have any other questions at the moment. So I'm going to go ahead and it's been a few minutes. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of start winding this down, but I'll check back here as I'm giving my little conclusion spiel here to see if anyone else has added any other questions. So thank you again, Dr. Karp, for the wonderful presentation. It was highly, highly informative. And thank you to all who attended. We certainly appreciate it. I just want to remind all of you on here that Fresno Audubon is on social media. We're on Facebook and Instagram. That's a great way to stay connected with us and stay in the loop about different upcoming events we have. We also have our YouTube channel, which is a great place to catch any recent general meeting presentations from the past 3 or so years. So definitely check that out if you have missed any presentations or want to review any of those. We do hope that you guys will join us for next month's general meeting, which is scheduled for Tuesday, May 9th. And let me make sure I have the name correct here. Tom Coombs-Hahn will be talking to us about the natural history of Western finches, which should be a really, really fascinating topic. So yeah, so do pay attention for links to registration and announcements for that event. And I am not seeing any other questions here in the chat box. So with that, I think we can probably go ahead and close it out. So thank you again, Dr. Karp, and thank you everyone who attended, and stay safe and have a great remainder of your week. Good night,
Yeah,
everybody.
thank you. Bye.